On a humid August morning in 1855, the air in Savannah, Georgia hung thick with heat and superstition. Beneath the awning of the city's waterfront slave market, a child stood barefoot on an auction block while the crowd pressed forward to see what had drawn such uneasy murmurs. He could not have been more than 11 years old, a frail figure with skin so pale it seemed to glow against the coarse wood beneath his feet. His eyes, an unsettling grape, inked, did not blink much, only drifted across the crowd as though searching for a face that might not despise him. The auctioneer, a man named Cyrus Petton, cleared his throat, his usual charm faltering as whispers rippled through the gathering. "Lot 47, he announced, his voice hesitant, "male child, approximately 11 years, from the Hutchinson estate near Augusta." He paused, eyes flicking to the boy, then back to the buyers. "As you can see, he bears a particular condition." He didn't say the word aloud, albinism, but everyone knew, in 1855 Georgia, such a condition was viewed not as a curiosity but as a curse. Both enslaved and free communities whispered that children like him brought blight upon the harvest, that their gaze could summon ghosts, that their very blood offended God. No one wanted to touch him. No one wanted to buy him. Petton opened the bidding at $20. Silence. He dropped to 15, then 10. A few men turned away entirely. Women fanned themselves as if to ward off bad luck. Finally, at $5, a voice broke the stillness. A woman's voice. She sat alone in a carriage parked at the edge of the crowd, her lace fan raised delicately, her face composed in calm assurance. $5, she said, heads turned, sold. The auctioneer cried, relieved to conclude what had become an uncomfortable spectacle. But as the woman, Margaret Dunor, rose from her seat, she added, "I shall pay $12 for him out of Christian charity." The crowd exhaled, soothed by her benevolence. A few called blessings after her, admiring her generosity. What none of them knew was that Margaret Dunor had been searching for a child exactly like this one for 3 years. Margaret Dunor was a woman who drew attention wherever she went, not for beauty but for presence. At 47, she carried herself with the composure of wealth and the authority of a mind accustomed to obedience. Widowed 13 years earlier, she had managed her late husband's vast plantation outside Savannah with ruthless efficiency, gaining a reputation for competence that made overseers uneasy. What few suspected, however, was the nature of her private obsession. Over the past decade, Margaret had filled an entire wing of her mansion with books, over 300 volumes on natural philosophy, anatomy, and the breeding of animals. She was fascinated by heredity, by the laws that governed how traits were passed from parent to child, how perfection might be engineered. And now, with the pale, trembling boy in her carriage, she believed she had found the key to proving her theories. She called it the Purification Project. As her carriage rolled away from the city and into the pine-lined road leading to Belmont Plantation, the boy sat pressed into a corner, silent. Margaret opened a leather-bound journal on her lap and began writing, her pen moving with steady precision. August 17th, 1855, she wrote, "Subject 0 acquired, pure expression of albinism confirmed, excellent potential for preliminary studies." Every few minutes she glanced at the boy, recording details, hair texture, eye color, hand size, complexion under shifting light. To her, he was not a child, he was a specimen. Across from her, the driver, Augustus, kept his eyes fixed on the road. He had served the Dunor family for more than 20 years, and he had learned to ask no questions. Still, a heaviness grew in his chest as he turned the horses toward the deeper woods. He knew the rumors about the compound hidden on Belmont's back acreage, how people taken there never returned. When the carriage reached its destination, the landscape changed. The main house stood far behind. Ahead stretched a cluster of newly painted white buildings, their geometry too precise for ordinary farm use. Margaret disembarked and gestured for the boy to follow. The interior of the largest building was clean, unnervingly so, whitewashed walls, glass windows, pine floors that smelled freshly scrubbed. She led him to a small room containing a bed, a chair, and a single shelf. "This will be your room," she said in a tone devoid of affection. "You will receive food, clothing, and education in exchange for cooperation. You will undergo medical examinations, measurements, and other procedures necessary to my research. If you obey, you will be treated well. If you disobey, punishment will be severe." The boy nodded. He did not yet understand her words, only that defiance meant pain. "Do you read?" she asked. He shook his head. "Then you will learn. Your lessons begin tomorrow." That night, when the door locked behind her, the boy sat awake on the bed, unable to lie down. Through the shuttered window he could hear the chirring of insects, the distant bark of dogs, and nothing else. No voices, no laughter, no sound of other children. The stillness was unnatural, like a place built for secrets rather than life. He did not yet know that somewhere beneath his feet, in the cool stone cellar, Margaret Dunor was already writing his future. In the lamplight, she recorded her impressions meticulously. Subject 0 represents the foundation upon which all subsequent phases will build, if theories prove correct. This acquisition validates 13 years of preparation. Her handwriting was small, flawless, almost beautiful. On another table lay diagrams of animal lineages, horses, cattle, hounds, annotated with notes about inheritance and selection. She believed the same laws applied to people, that by controlling who reproduced and how, she could refine the human race itself. She closed the journal and extinguished the lamp, satisfied. Upstairs, the boy finally drifted into uneasy sleep, unaware that his name, Thomas, had already been replaced by a number. Morning brought routine, measurements, weighing, and a breakfast portion calculated to the ounce. The overseer recorded his height against the wall, his pulse, his temperature, his posture. At 7 o'clock a nervous young tutor arrived from Savannah to teach him letters and arithmetic. Margaret told the man he was participating in a study of intellectual development among the enslaved. The tutor believed her. He came twice a week, and Thomas, quick, hungry to please, absorbed knowledge like dry earth drinking rain. Within months he could read sentences. By year's end, he was parsing medical texts he barely understood. His teacher marveled at his progress. Margaret only nodded. Education to her was not kindness. It was preparation. As the weeks passed, the compound revealed itself to Thomas in fragments. A distant building where voices murmured, the smell of chemicals from the basement, the rustle of papers as Margaret worked late into the night. Sometimes he glimpsed other people through the windows, but they moved like ghosts, silent and guarded. Once he heard a cry in the darkness, cut off too quickly to be an accident. He never asked about it again. He was learning the first rule of survival in Belmont. Curiosity was dangerous. By the close of that first year, Margaret's notes had grown to several volumes, and Thomas had learned enough anatomy to label every bone in the human body. Yet he still did not know why she had chosen him, why she studied him so carefully, why her eyes lingered on him not with affection, but with calculation. In the winter of 1856, as frost crusted the pines beyond the window, he would finally begin to understand, but for now he was only a child who believed obedience might keep him alive. Thomas's days at Belmont fell into a rhythm that was both orderly and suffocating, a routine crafted by Margaret Dunor with the precision of a scientist and the cruelty of someone who saw human beings as instruments rather than lives. Each morning began the same way, the metallic rattle of the key turning in the lock, the creak of the door as Margaret entered, the faint scent of lavender oil clinging to her black dress. She greeted him not with warmth, but with the brisk efficiency of a researcher examining a specimen. Measuring tape unfurled as she marked his height against the frame, recorded his weight in her notebook, and observed any change in his complexion or posture. She spoke rarely, and when she did, Her voice carried the smooth tone of someone utterly confident in her own authority. After she left, the door locked again, sealing him inside until his tutor arrived. The lessons were the only moments when Thomas felt remotely human. Christopher Vance, the nervous young man hired from Savannah, treated him with cautious politeness, unaware of the deeper horror surrounding them. Vance believed he was contributing to a study on education among enslaved children, a progressive notion he thought might one day prove their intellectual equality. He never questioned why only one student existed or why he was forbidden to ask about other residents. Twice a week he came, delivered his lessons, and left, while Margaret watched from the doorway, noting every hesitation, every question Thomas asked, every flicker of curiosity she could cultivate or suppress as needed. Thomas learned quickly: reading, writing, arithmetic, anatomy, and within a year could copy Margaret's own notes with such accuracy that she began using him as an assistant. Yet the more he learned, the more aware he became that his education was not for his benefit. Each book, each lesson about heredity, selection, and breeding, led toward something darker, something that made the air in the compound feel heavier by the day. At night, when the oil lamps burned low, he sometimes heard movement beyond his walls, footsteps, muffled cries, and once, a scream that broke through the silence like glass. He would cover his ears and rock against the cold wall, trying to pretend the sound was just the wind. Through the narrow window, he occasionally saw figures moving between buildings, always under escort, heads bowed. He came to understand that he was not alone in this place, though isolation made it easy to forget. Margaret controlled every detail of the compound with military precision. Supplies came on schedule, always delivered by Augustus, the old driver whose silence hid years of knowledge he dared not share. The people who worked there followed orders without question, not out of loyalty but out of fear. Everyone who entered Belmont knew that secrets were kept here, and those who pried too deeply did not return. To the outside world, Belmont was merely another plantation. To those within, it was a sealed world where science had replaced mercy. Margaret believed herself a pioneer. Her journals from that period, later discovered, reveal a mind both brilliant and monstrous. She wrote of controlled pairings, of hereditary purity, of breeding strength into weakness. She referred to the people in her charge as subjects, recording their physical traits in the same tone used for livestock. Each entry began with a date, a temperature reading, and a detached observation. Subject 12 displays desirable cranial proportions, or female specimen 7 demonstrates strong fertility characteristics. These words, written in fine, neat script, transformed human lives into data points. And beneath that data, Margaret began forming her most disturbing theory, that albinism represented what she called a window into original purity, a trait she believed could be harnessed to create what she imagined as a perfected human lineage. Thomas was the key, the beginning of that vision, the proof she had been seeking since her husband's death when grief had driven her into the cold comfort of scientific obsession. As Thomas grew, so did her experiments. She began explaining to him the concepts that underpinned her work, turning lessons into indoctrination. Sitting across from him in the compound's small study, she would unfold diagrams showing animal lineages: horses bred for speed, dogs for obedience, cattle for strength, and then transition seamlessly to human families, tracing physical traits across generations. She spoke of bloodlines, of purity and contamination, of how the world could be improved through careful selection. Her tone never changed whether she spoke of animals or people, and Thomas learned that interrupting her could bring punishment, not through violence but through isolation so complete it felt like vanishing. When she asked him questions about what he understood, he learned to answer with the logic she wanted, even when it sickened him. He knew now that she was not merely educating him, she was preparing him. For what? He did not yet fully grasp, But every day it became clearer that in her eyes he was not simply a student but a tool. He began to see patterns in her behavior. Margaret would sometimes leave the compound for several days, returning with new faces, men and women who looked frightened and confused. They disappeared into the other buildings and were rarely seen again. When he asked about them once, she fixed him with a look that froze his blood. "Your concern is not required," she said. "Knowledge must be earned, not assumed." After that, he never asked again. But in stolen moments, when Augustus delivered food or supplies, Thomas caught brief glimpses of compassion in the man's eyes, small flickers of humanity in a place that seemed designed to erase it. By 1857, when Thomas turned 14, Margaret's lessons shifted to the next stage. She began teaching him about reproduction, using medical texts and anatomical specimens preserved in glass jars. She spoke clinically of conception, gestation, and heredity, of how traits passed from parent to child, how undesirable elements could be bred out through control. Her words made his stomach twist, especially when she emphasized his own condition. "You, Thomas," she told him one afternoon, "represent the purest recessive form. If combined with the proper mate, the offspring will reveal what nature has hidden. You are the beginning of something new." He said nothing, afraid of what might come next, though a part of him already knew. Margaret saw him as both experiment and instrument, the seed from which her imagined perfection would grow. Outside the compound, the world moved on. Trains whistled through distant towns, the rumble of progress growing louder. But Belmont remained frozen in its own fevered isolation. Every tree, every building seemed to hold its breath beneath the weight of her ambition. The others in the compound, those Thomas glimpsed only in passing, grew thinner, quieter. At night, the air smelled of sickness and lie, and sometimes the faint metallic tang of blood drifted through the vents. He prayed without knowing to whom, whispered to himself that one day it would end, that something would stop her. Then, one humid evening, when illness kept him confined to bed, Augustus lingered a moment longer than usual after delivering his meal. His voice, low and careful, broke the silence of years. "You know she won't stop," he said. "Whatever she's planning, she won't stop, but you're smarter than most. Maybe you can figure something she can't." Then he was gone, the door closing softly behind him. Those few words planted something dangerous inside Thomas, not rebellion, not yet, but awareness. For the first time, he realized that the knowledge she gave him, the books she let him read, might become a weapon. If he learned enough, understood her work better than she did, perhaps one day he could undo it. And so he waited, silent, obedient, patient, because in a place like Belmont, survival began with pretending to believe. The arrival of Dr. Harrison Pembroke at Belmont in the autumn of 1858 marked the moment when Margaret's secret world began to shift from isolation to collaboration, though for Thomas it meant the tightening of his invisible chains. Pembroke appeared one gray October morning, tall, gaunt, and impeccably dressed, carrying with him the quiet authority of a man who had spent his life among scholars and physicians. He introduced himself as a representative of the Medical Society of Charleston, bringing letters of recommendation and polite curiosity about Margaret's private research. She welcomed him with the composure of a woman certain of her superiority, but cautious enough to measure her guest before revealing too much. Over tea in the parlor of her main house, she spoke in careful terms about heredity, controlled breeding, and the scientific potential of applying livestock principles to human subjects. Pembroke listened with keen interest, his long fingers drumming lightly on the table as he nodded along, and when she finally offered to show him her laboratory, his eyes gleamed with curiosity. The next morning, she led him through the dense pine forest to the hidden compound, the air thick with damp resin and the faint smell of decay. Margaret spoke as they walked, explaining that for 13 years she had documented the transmission of physical traits among the enslaved. that she had observed patterns suggesting heredity could be predicted and improved. Pembroke, whose fascination with inherited illness had made him both respected and controversial among Southern physicians, was enthralled. He asked sharp, specific questions about her methods, taking notes as if he were attending a university lecture rather than being escorted through a site of human suffering. When they reached the records room, his enthusiasm turned to awe. Row after row of shelves held leather-bound journals filled with charts, measurements, sketches, and birth records spanning more than a decade. "Extraordinary," he murmured, running a finger down the spines. "This level of detail, you've achieved what others only theorize." Margaret basked in the admiration, though she watched him closely for signs of moral hesitation. When he remarked on the high mortality rates noted in her ledgers, she replied smoothly that such losses were necessary sacrifices for progress, weak specimens being unfit for the next generation. Pembroke frowned, but curiosity soon overpowered conscience. Science, he reminded himself, required dispassion. Down in the compound's basement, under the flickering light of oil lamps, Margaret showed him the preserved specimens, rows of glass jars lined neatly on wooden shelves, each containing tissue samples, organs, or the tiny bodies of infants suspended in clear fluid. The air smelled of alcohol and rot, and for a brief moment even Pembroke faltered. "You performed the dissections yourself?" he asked. "After my physician in Savannah passed," Margaret replied, her tone calm, almost proud. "I have become proficient in anatomy. A woman must depend on her own skill when society denies her assistance." Pembroke studied her, impressed by her confidence, disturbed by her ease. "You have accomplished what few men would attempt," he said finally. "It deserves recognition." She smiled faintly, sensing the trap of flattery. "Publication would invite misunderstanding," she said. "The public is not ready to confront the truths of heredity." Yet inside, she was already calculating the advantage of having a trained physician attached to her work. If she could bind him to her through shared complicity, her research would gain legitimacy that secrecy alone could not provide. "Perhaps we might collaborate," Pembroke suggested, his voice low, deferential. "Your records combined with my medical analysis could produce results of lasting significance." Margaret hesitated, feigning humility, then nodded. "Very well, there is one subject you must see. He is the foundation of everything." She led him down a corridor to a locked room. When she opened the door, Thomas looked up from his desk where he had been copying anatomical diagrams. His pale face glowed in the afternoon light, and his eyes, soft gray and strangely luminous, met the stranger's gaze with wary calm. "This," Margaret said, her voice filled with pride, "is Subject Zero." Pembroke stepped closer, studying the boy with clinical fascination. He examined his hair, skin, and eyes, took his pulse, and asked him to speak. When Thomas answered in careful, educated tones, the doctor looked astonished. "He reads, writes?" he asked, fluently. Margaret replied. "He must understand the theories to participate effectively." "Participate?" Pembroke echoed. "You mean—" "Yes," she interrupted. "He will be paired with selected females once maturity is reached. Controlled breeding is essential to trace hereditary transmission of albinism." Pembroke was silent for a moment, torn between revulsion and excitement. His training told him this was monstrous. His ambition whispered that it was groundbreaking. "He is still young," he ventured weakly. "In this region," Margaret said coolly, "enslaved boys father children long before 15. What I do differs only in method and purpose. Mine is science." Pembroke exhaled slowly, then nodded. "If the process is documented properly, the findings could be revolutionary." It was the confirmation she needed. The partnership was sealed with a handshake, though for Thomas it felt like a verdict. That evening, Margaret visited his room, her face lit by lamplight and triumph. "Dr. Pembroke recognizes the value of our work," she said. "He will assist us in the next phase. You should feel honored, Thomas. Few are chosen to serve progress." He remained silent, his eyes fixed on the floor. "Do not mistake my kindness for weakness," she continued. "You were purchased for a purpose, and that purpose approaches." She left without waiting for a reply, the door locking behind her as always. When the sound of her footsteps faded, Thomas lay on the narrow bed, staring at the ceiling, his breath shallow with dread. The conversation he had overheard between them replayed in his mind, paired with selected females, breeding experiments, offspring for study. He understood now that Margaret's obsession was not just with understanding heredity, but with manipulating it, forcing life into patterns she could measure and control. His body, his existence, had become the vessel for her delusion. Yet amid the horror, a thought began to take shape, a fragile thread of hope woven from everything he had learned. He had read her books, studied her theories, traced the patterns of her failures. He knew that her predictions often proved wrong, that nature refused to obey her rigid logic. Perhaps, he thought, if her experiments produced confusion instead of clarity, if her results contradicted her expectations, she might lose her certainty. And if she ever faltered, even briefly, that weakness might open a door for him. For the first time, he began to understand the power of knowledge not as submission but as defiance. Outside, the night deepened. In the darkness of the compound, the pine trees swayed and whispered, and from somewhere distant came the faint cry of an owl. Thomas closed his eyes and made a silent vow. He would survive, learn everything she wanted him to learn, obey every command, and wait. Because someday, when the moment came, knowledge, the same weapon she had given him, would be the blade that set him free. The winter that followed brought with it a suffocating silence that settled over Belmont like a shroud, and beneath that silence, Margaret's project descended into its darkest phase. Dr. Pembroke returned to the plantation in mid-November 1858, bringing with him medical instruments packed neatly in brass cases, and the cold assurance of a man who had convinced himself that cruelty in the name of science was still progress. Margaret greeted him as an ally, her confidence sharpened by his validation. She had already selected 3 women from among those held in the compound, Eliza, Sarah, and Hannah, each chosen according to her meticulous charts of lineage, physical form, and what she called hereditary promise. Purpose was simple and horrifying. Thomas, now 15 and no longer a boy, but not yet a man, was to be bred with them. Margaret explained this with the same detachment she used to describe her crop rotations or the birthing of livestock. She showed Pembroke the ledgers detailing their traits, gestation history, and supposed genetic value, her words smooth and unwavering. "We will begin immediately," she said. "Each pairing must be observed, documented, and replicated. Only controlled unions can reveal the true path of heredity." Pembroke nodded, his hand trembling slightly as he adjusted his spectacles. There was no longer hesitation in his eyes, only grim fascination. Thomas was informed of his role the night before the first pairing. Margaret sat across from him in her study, the firelight turning her face into a mask of flickering shadows. "You have been prepared for this," she said, her tone almost tender. "Your cooperation is essential to understanding how nature transmits purity." He stared at her, unblinking, every word sinking like ice through his chest. He knew better than to argue. Defiance would bring punishment, perhaps worse. So he nodded once, his throat tight, and said nothing. When she left, locking the door as always, he sat motionless for hours, the silence in the room louder than any scream. The next day, Eliza was brought to him. She was 19, tall and slender, her skin the color of light coffee, her face beautiful in a weary, hollow way that spoke of too much loss. Margaret stood between them, explaining in cold, clinical language what was expected, as though she were assigning chores. Then she left, turning the key behind her. For a long time, neither Thomas nor Eliza spoke. They stood at opposite sides of the small room, prisoners caught in the same nightmare. Finally, she broke the silence in a voice soft and flat, stripped of all emotion. "I seen you before," she said. "The white boy she keeps locked up. You been here long?" "4 years," Thomas replied. Eliza nodded, her eyes distant. "She took my baby 2 years ago, said the child died. But I heard crying for days after, then nothing. Maybe she lied, maybe she didn't, doesn't matter now." Her words trembled, not from fear but from exhaustion. "We do what she says. It's the only way to survive." What happened next was the kind of horror that left no visible scars, but carved its mark deep into the soul. When Margaret returned an hour later, followed by Pembroke with his notebooks and instruments, the air in the room had changed. Eliza sat staring at the wall, her face blank. Thomas sat on the bed, shoulders rigid, his eyes hollow. Pembroke examined Eliza with detached professionalism, recording measurements, pulse, and temperature as if documenting a scientific specimen. He noted physical responses, recorded observations of compliance and cooperation, then moved on to Thomas, inspecting him with equal detachment. To both of them, their pain was data, their humiliation a variable. When it was done, Margaret locked Thomas in his room again. He washed his hands until the skin burned, then lay on the bed, staring at the ceiling until dawn. A week later, it was Sarah's turn. She was younger, barely 18, with sharp eyes that still held defiance. When Margaret explained her role, Sarah refused. "You can kill me, but I won't do this," she said, her voice shaking with rage. "You know this ain't right." Margaret's face hardened. "You have no choice," she replied. When Sarah continued to resist, Margaret had her dragged to the isolation room, a windowless cellar with a dirt floor and a single cot. There, she was kept for 6 days with only water and scraps of bread. Each day Margaret visited, urging her to reconsider. On the 4th day, Pembroke accompanied her, speaking in the calm voice of a physician explaining a medical fact. "You are damaging your body with this resistance," he said. "You risk permanent harm." Sarah said nothing. On the 6th day, Margaret brought Eliza to the door. "Tell her what happens," Margaret ordered. Eliza, trembling, obeyed. "She'll do it anyway," she whispered. "Better to live through it than die fighting." Sarah's eyes filled with tears, and she turned away. The next morning, too weak to stand, she surrendered. The overseer carried her to Thomas's room. What followed was not consent, but exhaustion given form. Pembroke's notes from that day, later discovered, described the event in chillingly clinical terms. Subject resistant, but ultimately compliant. Recommend improved conditioning for future pairings. By the time Hannah was brought in early December, resistance had died before it began. She was 21, her spirit already worn thin by years in the compound. She obeyed every command without expression, her eyes fixed somewhere far beyond the room. Pembroke wrote afterward that subject demonstrates optimal compliance, suggesting successful conditioning. For Thomas, the weeks blurred into numbness. He existed between horror and emptiness, doing what was demanded because not doing so meant worse. At night, he read obsessively, anything to drown thought in words and diagrams. Yet, even through that numbness, he began to notice patterns. Margaret's predictions rarely matched her outcomes. Her theories about heredity, once presented as certainty, now faltered under the weight of contradiction. He clung to that realization like a lifeline. Months passed, and of the 3 women, only Eliza conceived. Margaret called it a victory. Pembroke called it confirmation. Eliza called it another curse. Through winter and spring of 1859, Margaret and Pembroke monitored the pregnancy like an experiment, recording every change, every heartbeat. Eliza's belly swelled, her steps grew slower, and the light in her eyes dimmed to a quiet despair. Thomas saw her once across the courtyard. Their eyes met only briefly, and in that moment he understood that she knew what he already feared. Whatever came from this would not be a child but another instrument in Margaret's delusion. When the baby was born in May, after 18 hours of agony, Margaret's disappointment was immediate. The infant, a girl, was healthy, but her skin was light brown, her eyes dark. Not the purity Margaret had expected. Recessive trait, Pembroke said, making notes. Requires both parents to carry it. Further generations necessary. Margaret nodded coldly. Then she will be bred back to subject 0 when mature. Eliza, barely conscious, heard those words and began to sob, a sound that grew into something beyond human grief. For a week she was allowed to nurse her child. On the 7th night, when the compound was quiet and the moon hid behind clouds, she made her choice. The next morning the wet nurse found her lying still, her arms wrapped tightly around the tiny body that no longer breathed. Margaret recorded the event in her ledger with chilling detachment. Generation 1, female 1 expired. Subject Eliza disposed of as unreliable. No further explanation, no mark of sorrow. After that, the compound changed. Even the air seemed heavier. Workers moved more quietly, dogs stopped barking at night, and Margaret herself began to spend long hours alone in her study, writing furiously. The others whispered that Eliza's ghost wandered the halls, but Thomas knew it wasn't ghosts haunting Belmont, it was guilt. Though Margaret would never admit it, something in her order had cracked. The project continued, the journals grew thicker, but the perfection she sought slipped further away, and in the stillness that followed Eliza's death, a seed of consequence had begun to take root. It would take only one visitor, one moment of conscience, to make it bloom into the ruin she could not yet foresee. The summer of 1859 came heavy with heat and omens, the kind that made the air shimmer above the red earth, and turned every sound into a whisper of something watching from the trees. And into that suffocating stillness arrived the man who would begin the unraveling of everything Margaret had built. Dr. Samuel Hargrave from Atlanta came to Belmont in early July, accompanied by his young medical assistant, Robert Chen. Hargrave was a man of reputation and ambition, gray-haired but sharp-eyed, whose curiosity had been stirred by whispers of a private research facility in Georgia, conducting advanced hereditary studies. He had read one of Pembroke's recent papers, which hinted at experiments too bold to print in full, and had written to Margaret requesting a visit. She saw opportunity in his letter, the chance to replace Pembroke, whose nerves and drinking had begun to compromise his usefulness, and so she invited him. When Hargrave arrived, she received him in the main parlor, the curtains drawn against the blinding sun, the scent of rosewater faint in the air. Chen stood behind him, a quiet presence, barely 24, with dark hair and the wary composure of someone who watched everything but spoke only when necessary. He listened intently as Margaret guided them through her explanations, her voice smooth and measured, rehearsed through years of self-justification. Hargrave nodded, intrigued, but Chen's brow furrowed slightly as she spoke of controlled pairings and selective propagation. Still, they followed when she offered to show them the compound. The path through the pines was long and silent, the only sounds the creak of carriage wheels and the hum of cicadas. When they reached the clearing, Margaret led them into the records building, proudly displaying shelves lined with journals, ledgers, and anatomical sketches. Hargrave murmured his admiration, tracing the spines of books that represented human suffering, transmuted into neat script. But Chen's face grew paler as he read snippets aloud. Phrases like subject expired due to degenerative weakness, and pairing terminated. When Margaret led them downstairs to the basement where the preserved specimens stood in rows, the air sharp with alcohol and decay, Hargrave maintained his professional detachment, but Chen could not hide his horror. Some of the jars held tissue samples, others whole infants suspended in cloudy liquid, their small faces blurred by time. "You did these dissections yourself?" Chen asked quietly. "I did," Margaret answered, her tone calm, almost proud. "Each one contributes to understanding hereditary transmission." Chen stared at her, his voice trembling with restrained fury. "These are not samples," he said. "These are people." She smiled thinly. "They were property, Mr. Chen. Legally, they remain so. I have merely repurposed what society already discards." Hargrave interjected before Chen could speak again, soothing her ego with words about the advancement of science, but the young assistant said nothing further. His silence was not surrender, it was the gathering of outrage waiting for its moment. When Margaret introduced them to Thomas later that day, the boy's pallor startled them both. This, she said, gesturing with pride, is Subject 0, the cornerstone of my research. Thomas rose from his seat, his thin frame trembling only slightly as Hargrave examined him with polite curiosity. "How long has he been under your observation?" Hargrave asked. 4 years, Margaret replied. "Educated, measured, conditioned. He will ensure the continuity of the project." Chen studied the boy's eyes, gray, distant, haunted, and felt his chest tighten. "Do you wish to be here?" he asked softly. The question seemed to confuse Thomas, as though it were written in a language he had forgotten. He hesitated, then whispered, "No, sir." Margaret's lips thinned. "He misunderstands his purpose," she said sharply. "Sentimentality clouds reason, Mr. Chen. Remember that." Hargrave gave a curt nod, ending the exchange, but the answer had already lodged in Chen's conscience like a splinter. That evening, during supper at the main house, the conversation turned to science and morality. Hargrave praised Margaret's dedication, comparing her to pioneers of medical discovery who had endured public scorn for daring to challenge conventional thought. "History rewards courage," he said. Chen, unable to stay silent any longer, set down his fork. "History also remembers cruelties, sir," he said quietly. "It remembers those who confuse power with knowledge." Margaret's gaze hardened, her politeness curdling into disdain. "You are young," she said. "You have been taught to feel rather than think. The world is not changed by feelings. It is shaped by those who impose order on chaos. Even when that order is built on suffering." Chen asked. "Suffering," Margaret replied, "is the cost of progress. It always has been." The table fell silent after that. When dawn came, Hargrave and Chen prepared to leave. Margaret dismissed them curtly, her pride wounded by Chen's insolence. As they walked down the hall toward the front door, Chen paused by the corridor leading to Thomas's room. Through the small window in the door he saw the boy bent over his desk, reading by the dim light of an oil lamp. Something in that still image, the pale child imprisoned among books meant to dehumanize him, broke through whatever restraint remained. He tapped on the glass, softly. Thomas looked up, startled. "What is your name?" Chen asked. "Thomas, sir." "How long have you been here?" 5 years. Chen hesitated, then asked the question that would change both their fates. "Do you want to leave?" Thomas stared at him, uncertain if it was a trick. After a long silence he nodded. "Yes." Chen's throat tightened. "Then remember me," he said. "I will remember you." Hargrave's voice called from down the hall and Chen turned away. Thomas watched through the window as the two men departed, their carriage rolling down the dirt road until it vanished among the trees, taking with it the first flicker of hope he had known since his capture. The journey back to Atlanta was tense. Hargrave argued that Margaret's work, however disturbing, represented a rare opportunity for understanding hereditary laws, but Chen would not yield. "You call it understanding," he said, "but what I saw was murder disguised as study." Hargrave warned him to be cautious, reminding him that a woman like Margaret held influence and wealth enough to crush reputations. Yet Chen's resolve only hardened. When they returned, he began writing letters, first to the medical society, then to abolitionist groups, then to newspapers, detailing what he had witnessed, the forced pairings, the preserved bodies, the systematic breeding of human beings for experiment. His words were careful, clinical, undeniable, but in 1859 Georgia they found no audience. Editors rejected his accounts, calling them unverified allegations. The medical society dismissed his claims as the rantings of an overzealous foreigner. Even abolitionists, already overwhelmed by the growing national crisis, offered sympathy but no support. Still, Chen persisted. He gathered testimonies from anyone who had heard whispers about Belmont, piecing together fragments of truth. His search led him eventually to a man whose conscience had also begun to crumble under years of silence. Augustus, Margaret's longtime driver. They met in secret one January night in 1860, in an empty warehouse near the Savannah docks. Augustus spoke in a low, trembling voice, unburdening 14 years of guilt. He described the hidden compound, the people who vanished, the small cemetery in the forest marked only by numbered stakes, the graves he had helped dig under moonlight. He told Chen about Eliza and her child, about the screams that haunted the nights, about Thomas, the pale boy who had been turned into a living experiment. When he finished, Chen placed a hand on his arm. "You've done enough harm by silence," he said softly. "Now you've done good by truth." Augustus nodded, tears tracing through the dust on his cheeks. Armed with maps, names, and dates, Chen went to the county sheriff, William Pritchard, and laid everything before him. Pritchard was not a man given to moral courage, but the evidence was too detailed to ignore. On January 23, 1860, accompanied by 2 deputies and Chen himself, he rode to Belmont under a court order. Margaret met them at the door, her face pale with fury, but she could not deny them entry. When they reached the compound, the truth could no longer hide behind science. The buildings were half empty, the journals burned, the remaining subjects starved and terrified. In the basement, the jars still stood in their rows, silent witnesses to years of horror. And in one locked room they found Thomas, 15 years old, alive, trembling, and able to recount every moment of what Margaret had done. When they found Thomas, the boy could hardly speak at first. His voice came out as a cracked whisper, each word trembling under the weight of years spent in silence and obedience. Yet as he realized that the faces before him were not Margaret's, no cold eyes, no notebooks, no instruments, something inside him began to break open. He told them everything in fragments, the measurements, the punishments, the births, the deaths, the endless testing that had filled his childhood like a nightmare that never ended. Chen knelt beside him, his voice gentle, steady, promising safety, though the word itself felt foreign in that place. "You're free now," he said, but Thomas only stared at him, confusion flickering in his pale eyes. He had no memory of freedom, no understanding of what it meant. Margaret stood in the doorway, her composure beginning to fracture, her lips twitching as she tried to reclaim control. "You have no authority here," she told the sheriff. "These are my property, my research materials. I have broken no law." Her words, sharp and steady, carried the weight of entitlement centuries old, but even Pritchard, accustomed to ignoring cruelty when it hid behind wealth, felt unease stirring in his chest. "You'll come with us," he said. "Until we sort this out." Margaret's face darkened. "You cannot comprehend what I have achieved here," she hissed. "History will vindicate me. Science will vindicate me." But when they led her away, her hands bound, and she caught sight of Thomas standing at the threshold of the room where she had kept him for half a decade, her voice faltered. "You owe your life to me," she said softly. "Without me, you are nothing." Thomas said nothing. He only turned away, his thin shoulders trembling as if he had stepped into a world too large to understand. The compound was sealed off within hours. Deputies searched the buildings, uncovering rooms filled with surgical tools, ledgers of meticulous cruelty, and graves in the woods marked by wooden stakes, bearing only numbers. Pritchard, who had arrived expecting exaggeration, left pale and silent. Chen helped gather the surviving subjects, frightened men and women who flinched at sudden sounds, their bodies scarred and starved. Some were too weak to walk, others refused to leave, as if the forest beyond the compound frightened them more than the walls that had held them captive. Among them, Thomas moved like a ghost, silent but watchful. When he saw Augustus among the crowd, the old driver lowered his gaze, guilt etched deep into his features. "I should have stopped her," he whispered. "Long time ago, I should have." Thomas placed a trembling hand on his arm. "You did now," he said simply, and in that brief touch, forgiveness passed between them like something fragile and final. By nightfall, Margaret sat in a holding cell in Savannah, her fine black dress replaced by coarse prison linen. She demanded writing paper, claiming she would document everything for the scientific record, but none was provided. Instead, she stared through the bars, her mind calculating even as the walls closed in. Pembroke had fled days before the raid, vanishing into the southern countryside, leaving behind his notes and reputation. Chen remained in Savannah, determined to ensure that the truth would not vanish as quietly as the victims had. He spent days transcribing Thomas's testimony, copying Margaret's ledgers, cataloging the evidence. The more he wrote, the more monstrous the pattern became, a cold arithmetic of suffering justified by the pursuit of perfection. Yet even with proof, justice was uncertain. The law had no framework for crimes like hers. The enslaved had no legal standing, and scientific cruelty hid easily behind property rights. When Margaret's trial began in March 1860, the courtroom was packed, not with sympathizers but with the curious, drawn by whispers of the Savannah experiment. The prosecution laid out the evidence, the graves, the journals, the preserved remains. Chen testified with steady clarity, describing what he had seen. Thomas, trembling, stood before the court and told his story in halting words that silenced the room. But when Margaret was allowed to speak, she transformed herself again into the image of dignity wronged. "My work was never cruelty," she said. "It was vision. I sought to elevate humanity, not destroy it. Every great discovery is born of sacrifice. Would you condemn the surgeon for cutting flesh, the chemist for burning?" Her words stirred unease among the jurors. In that era, it was easy to cloak atrocity in the language of intellect. In the end, the verdict was hollow. Margaret was found guilty only of unlawful medical practice and fined heavily, her property seized, but she was not imprisoned for long. Within months, she was released under the pretext of fragile health, retreating to a distant cousin's estate in Charleston, where she lived out her days writing letters to scientific societies that never answered. Chen, disgusted but undeterred, ensured that her records were sent north, to abolitionist papers, to universities, to anyone who would listen. Slowly, fragments of her crimes began to spread, disguised as rumor at first, then as horror stories in medical circles. But history, ever reluctant to remember the suffering of the powerless, let her fade into obscurity. Belmont was abandoned, its buildings collapsing under vines and silence. By the time the Civil War reached Georgia, few remembered that it had ever existed. For Thomas, freedom was a word that tasted strange for years. He lived under Chen's care for a time, first in Savannah, then in Philadelphia, where the doctor relocated before the war. There, in a small rented house on Pine Street, Thomas began the slow work of relearning what it meant to live. He read constantly, sometimes through the night, devouring books on anatomy, philosophy, and astronomy, subjects Margaret had twisted into cruelty, but that he reclaimed for himself. Chen guided him with patience, never pushing, never demanding. "Knowledge isn't what she made it," he told him once. "It's not a cage, it's a key." But even in safety, Thomas carried the shadows of Belmont. He woke from dreams of footsteps in long corridors, of whispers behind locked doors, of the sound of a pen scratching across paper as his life was catalogued line by line. When the war began, Chen enlisted as a field surgeon for the Union Army, leaving Thomas behind with the promise of return. In 1863, a letter arrived instead, stained, brief, written by another hand. Chen had died at Gettysburg, struck by stray fire while tending the wounded. Thomas folded the letter carefully and placed it between the pages of one of the few surviving journals he had kept. Margaret's handwriting on one side, his memories on the other. After that, he moved often, working as a teacher in small northern schools, his pale face and southern accent marking him as an outsider everywhere he went. Yet he persisted, quiet and diligent, carrying within him the testimony of all who had not survived. Years later, when the war was only a story told by the old to the young, a journalist seeking material for a serialized history found him in a small town in Maryland. The man, a skeptic by nature, listened as Thomas, then in his 30s, frail but composed, told the story of Belmont. He spoke without bitterness, without exaggeration, as if each word were a stone he had carried too long. When he finished, the journalist asked if he hated her, the woman who had destroyed so many lives. Thomas was silent for a long moment before answering. "Hate is what she taught," he said softly, If I keep it, then I'm still hers. The article was published the following spring under the title The Purification Project, a survivor's account. It caused outrage, disbelief, and debate. Some called it fabrication. Others saw in it a warning about the dangers of unchecked ambition disguised as science. The world moved on, but the name Margaret Dunor became a ghost story whispered in medical halls, a reminder of how knowledge, when stripped of compassion, could become its own kind of darkness. And so Belmont vanished from the maps, its ruins swallowed by forest and time. Yet when the wind rose through the pines, locals swore they could still hear faint echoes of crying, the rustle of pages turning in an empty house, the distant voice of a boy repeating lessons meant to break him, but that instead made him wise. Thomas lived a long life quietly, leaving behind no children, no wealth, only the truth he had carried like a torch through darkness. In the end, it was enough. The world forgot Margaret's name, but it remembered her sin, not in books or monuments, but in the whispered caution passed from one generation of healers to the next, that no pursuit of knowledge is pure if it begins with the suffering of the innocent. Years rolled forward like a tide erasing footprints, and by the dawn of the 20th century, the story of Belmont existed only in fragments, whispered among doctors who preferred to believe it a myth rather than an echo of their own profession's darkest hour. Yet the past has a way of resurfacing when it is least expected. In 1901, a young physician named Dr. Evelyn Harcourt, curious, brilliant, and newly appointed to a research position at Johns Hopkins, stumbled upon a collection of anonymous documents in the university's archives labeled Southern Hereditary Studies, 1850-1860. The handwriting was elegant, deliberate, and cold. Each page detailed observations on human breeding and experimental pairings in Georgia. At first, Evelyn assumed it to be fiction, some grotesque satire of antebellum pseudoscience, until she came across a name written faintly on the back of one torn ledger page. T. Survivor account, recorded by Dr. S. Chen. That single letter set her on a path that would consume the next decade of her life. She began tracing every clue she could find: medical journals, personal letters, regional records, slowly piecing together the forgotten existence of Belmont Plantation and the horrors conducted there under the guise of the Purification Project. Her colleagues dismissed her obsession, calling it a distraction from real science, but Evelyn pressed on, driven by something she could not yet name, something like inheritance, an urge to pull truth from the bones of history and make it answer for its silence. By 1904, Evelyn had tracked down one surviving document written in Thomas's own hand, preserved in a dusty local archive in Philadelphia. It was a thin, faded notebook, its ink smudged but still legible. Inside, in careful script, were two opposing voices, Margaret's words copied verbatim, followed by Thomas's quiet rebuttals, as if he had been correcting her long after her death. She believed heredity was purity. One entry read, "I have learned it is memory. What we carry forward is not blood, but what we refuse to repeat." Evelyn copied those lines again and again, her hands shaking, her mind alive with the weight of what she'd uncovered. She began writing papers about the ethics of scientific experimentation, quoting Thomas without revealing his identity. In lecture halls filled with skeptical men, she spoke calmly of compassion as the truest form of knowledge, of the dangers of research divorced from morality. Some scoffed, some listened, but a few, particularly among younger physicians and reformers, heard her message and took it to heart. Quietly, her words began to ripple outward. Yet truth never travels without resistance. In 1907, one of Evelyn's papers was leaked to the press under the sensational headline, "The Savannah Experiments: Forgotten Crimes of Southern Science." The article spread rapidly, provoking outrage, fascination, and denial. Newspapers published illustrations of imagined laboratories filled with caged subjects, and public debate erupted between those who condemned the cruelty and those who dismissed it as northern exaggeration. The controversy reached Charleston, where Margaret's surviving relatives still lived, their fortune built on the remnants of the Dunor estate. They publicly denounced Evelyn, calling her claims libel against an honorable family, and hired lawyers to suppress further publication. For a time it seemed they would succeed. Her funding was cut, her lectures cancelled, and colleagues distanced themselves to avoid scandal. But Evelyn, like Thomas before her, refused silence. She began traveling at her own expense, giving talks in small halls and universities, carrying Thomas's notebook with her like scripture. Each time she spoke, she read a single passage aloud, the line he had written at the end of his final entry, "To remember is to heal what was broken by forgetting." Those words, simple and quiet, silenced even the harshest rooms. In 1910, Evelyn received a letter from an elderly man in Maryland claiming to have known Thomas personally. The letter was brief, written in a trembling hand. "He was my teacher when I was a boy. Told us stories that didn't sound real until I grew old enough to see how truth hides in shame. He said one day someone would come looking for what he left behind. Maybe that's you." Attached to the letter was a faded photograph, grainy, cracked at the edges, of Thomas standing beside a wooden schoolhouse, a group of children around him. He looked thin, solemn, yet peaceful, as though the years had finally given him something close to quiet. Evelyn stared at the image for a long time, then pinned it above her desk. From that day forward, every lecture she gave began not with theory, but with a story. The Great War came, and with it, new kinds of laboratories, new justifications for cruelty in the name of progress. Scientists spoke again of purity, of selection, of improving the human stock. Evelyn watched with dread as echoes of Margaret's rhetoric resurfaced in the polished vocabulary of modern eugenics. Her warnings were drowned out by national pride and the seductive promise of control. But she continued to write, to remind, to quote the boy who had once survived Belmont. "Science," she told her students, "is not a ladder to perfection, but a mirror held to our choices. Look too long without conscience, and you will see only monsters staring back." Some of her words found their way into textbooks, others into the quiet conscience of a generation that would later witness atrocities on a scale even Margaret could not have imagined. When Evelyn died in 1938, her personal papers were sealed according to her will, marked for release in 50 years. Inside the trunk were Thomas's notebook, her correspondence, and her unpublished manuscript titled The Purification Project, a study in conscience. When the trunk was finally opened in 1988, historians were astonished by the depth of her research. The manuscript, later published, reignited academic debate and public reckoning with early American medical ethics. Journalists traveled to Georgia, rediscovering the ruins of Belmont buried beneath wild pines and moss. Excavations unearthed fragments of glass jars, rusted instruments, and human remains carefully aligned in forgotten graves. DNA testing in the decades that followed confirmed the mixed ancestry of the victims. Men, women, and children whose bloodlines spanned continents. They were given names where once there had been only numbers. Memorial stones were raised at the site, each inscribed with a single shared epitaph. In pursuit of purity, they found pain. In remembrance, they find peace. And so, more than a century after the boy with the pale skin stood trembling on an auction block, the truth he had carried in silence returned to the world like light through a crack in a tomb. The story of Belmont no longer belonged to scholars or jurors or the cruel woman who had built it. It belonged to those who remembered, to those who refused to let history bury its victims under the polite language of science. In the end, the legacy of Thomas and Evelyn became inseparable, two voices echoing across time, joined by a single truth: that the measure of knowledge is not how much it discovers, but how deeply it refuses to forget what it costs. And somewhere, deep in the overgrown woods of Georgia, where the foundations of Belmont still slept beneath vines and silence, the wind moved softly through the trees, carrying with it the faint murmur of pages turning, the whisper of a child once taught to obey who instead learned to bear witness, and the eternal promise of remembrance, quiet, enduring, and finally free. By the time the 21st century unfolded in screens and satellites, the story of Belmont had transformed from a buried crime into a living conversation about the limits of science and the weight of memory. Much of the world still knew it only through footnotes and documentaries that smoothed its horror into narrative ease. In 2005, the University of Georgia's medical faculty approved a new ethics curriculum titled The Belmont Inquiry, using excerpts from Evelyn Harcourt's manuscript and Thomas's recovered writings as required reading for all incoming researchers. For most students, it was another module to complete, a historical caution meant to satisfy accreditation boards, but for a few it became something more, a haunting echo that refused to fade. Among them was a graduate student named Lee Dunor, a descendant of Margaret's brother, who had grown up hearing whispers that her family name carried a curse. She had dismissed the stories as superstition until she opened an old chest in her grandmother's attic and found letters sealed with the initials M.D., brittle pages describing the pursuit of refinement through controlled lineage. The signature, Margaret Dunor, made her hands tremble. The blood in her veins felt suddenly heavy, threaded with guilt she had never earned. Lee began her thesis determined to understand the woman behind the myth. She visited archives, combed through Evelyn's papers, and read the full transcript of Thomas's account preserved in the Library of Congress. The deeper she went, the less she saw a caricature of evil, and the more she saw the dangerous banality of certainty. A woman who believed cruelty could be redeemed by intellect. Lee's professors warned her to tread carefully. The name Dunor still provoked unease among historians. But she persisted, and in 2008 she traveled to the site itself. The road to Belmont was narrow now, reclaimed by forest. Kudzu and pine had swallowed the remains of the compound, the air thick with the hum of cicadas and the scent of wet earth. Only fragments remained, the stone foundations of the laboratory, shards of glass glinting faintly in the soil, the faint outline of the well where the overseer's quarters once stood. Standing there, Lee felt the strange dual pull of blood and conscience, the inheritance of both perpetrator and penitent. She knelt by one of the memorial stones and whispered the names she had learned from Evelyn's notes: Eliza, Sarah, Hannah, Thomas. The forest answered only with wind, soft and indifferent, as if reminding her that remembrance was an act done not for forgiveness but for balance. That night she stayed in a nearby inn and could not sleep. The air buzzed with memory, and when she closed her eyes she saw flashes: Margaret's ink-stained fingers, Thomas's pale face in the lamplight, Evelyn's weary eyes bending over a desk. In that sleepless darkness, she began writing, not a thesis but a confession of lineage. "I am of her blood," she wrote, "but I am not of her mind. If the past moves through us like marrow, then I will use it to build, not to harm." She titled the manuscript Inheritance of Light, unaware that it would one day become one of the most studied works of bioethics in modern academia. Published in 2010, it blended personal narrative with historical investigation, tracing the evolution of Belmont's legacy from atrocity to accountability. Critics praised its courage, some accused it of exploiting suffering for redemption. Lee accepted both judgments as part of the same truth. Every act of remembering wounds and heals at once. Her research reignited public interest in Belmont. Documentarians arrived with drones and cameras, capturing the ruins in golden dusk light, narrating over them in solemn tones. Politicians issued formal apologies for the state's historical complicity, and universities established scholarships in the names of the victims. Yet beyond the ceremonies and speeches, something quieter began to take root, a shift in how people spoke about science itself. The story of Belmont became required reading not just for medical students, but for technologists, geneticists, and data scientists. A reminder that progress without empathy repeats old sins under new names. Lee was invited to speak at conferences where artificial intelligence researchers debated the ethics of creation. Standing before vast digital screens displaying code instead of cells, she told them about Margaret's conviction that intelligence justified control. Every generation believes its tools are different, she said, but the danger is always the same, when knowledge stops asking whether it should, and only asks whether it can. Her words lingered in the hall like a quiet warning. One evening, after a lecture in Boston, an elderly woman approached Lee carrying a small velvet pouch. Inside was a tarnished locket engraved with the initials T.C. and a folded scrap of paper so old it nearly disintegrated when touched. The note read, in fading ink, "For whoever carries the Dunor name, remember not her ambition, but his endurance." The woman explained that it had belonged to her great-grandfather, one of Thomas's students in Maryland, passed down through generations. Lee wept, realizing the circle had closed in a way neither Thomas nor Evelyn could have foreseen. The line of the oppressor and the line of the oppressed meeting, not in vengeance, but in recognition. In 2015, the Belmont Memorial was rededicated. This time it was not just historians and officials who attended but descendants of the enslaved, of the doctors, of the Dunor family itself. They stood together in the clearing beneath the pines, holding candles as dusk settled into violet shadows. Lee read aloud from Thomas's notebook, her voice trembling as she spoke his final recorded words, "Knowledge must kneel before mercy, or it will burn the world that feeds it." The crowd fell silent. Fireflies rose from the grass like sparks of memory, and for a fleeting moment, the forest seemed to breathe again. Somewhere between the rustle of branches and the hum of night insects, the pain that had once filled that place began to loosen, not erased but finally acknowledged. After the ceremony, Lee remained alone among the stones. She placed the locket at the foot of the largest marker and whispered a quiet promise to guard what had been learned, to never let ambition outrun empathy. Above her, the stars shimmered through the branches, the same sky that had watched Margaret's cruelty, Thomas's endurance, Evelyn's pursuit, and now her own redemption. The wind carried through the trees a sound almost like turning pages, as though the forest itself were still reading the sentence.